The sun was setting behind the neat rows of houses on Maple Street when David Williams turned his car onto the quiet suburban road. It had been a good day visiting his mother, helping her plant new flowers in her garden and fixing a loose step on her front porch. These simple moments meant everything to him now, especially after spending months overseas in places where peace felt like a distant memory. David was 32 years old, a decorated Navy SEAL who had served 3 tours of duty in some of the world's most dangerous places. But right now, dressed in his simple jeans and t-shirt, he looked like any other young man heading home after a family visit. His car, a reliable sedan he'd bought 2 years ago, had never given him any trouble before. That's why he was so surprised. When it started making strange noises, at first, it was just a small cough from the engine. David thought maybe he needed to get gas soon. But then the coughing got worse. The car started shaking a little, and David could feel something was definitely wrong. He pressed the gas pedal, but instead of speeding up, the car seemed to hesitate, like it was struggling to breathe. The neighborhood around him was the kind of place where every lawn was perfectly cut and every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. White picket fences lined the sidewalks, and expensive cars sat in driveways that looked like they were washed every weekend. David had grown up in a very different neighborhood where broken streetlights and cracked sidewalks were normal. But he didn't feel out of place here. He was an American serviceman who had earned the right to drive on any street in the country he'd sworn to protect. Suddenly, the engine made a loud grinding noise and died completely. David felt the car lose power as he quickly steered it to the curb. He tried turning the key, pumping the gas pedal, even waiting a few minutes before trying again. Nothing worked. The car was completely dead. And David found himself stranded on a street where he didn't know anyone. He popped the hood and looked inside, hoping to spot something obvious like a loose wire or an empty fluid container. But everything looked normal to his untrained eye. David was trained to handle complex military equipment, but car engines were a mystery to him. He pulled out his phone and called roadside assistance, explaining his location and the problem. "We'll have someone out to you within 45 minutes. The operator told him. David thanked her and hung up, then leaned against his car to wait. The evening air was cool and comfortable, and the street was so quiet he could hear birds singing in the trees. It seemed like a perfect place to wait for help. What David didn't know was that he was being watched. Mrs. Peterson, a 67-year-old retired teacher, had been washing dishes in her kitchen when she noticed the unfamiliar car pull over. Through her window, she could see a young black man standing next to the vehicle, and something about the situation made her uncomfortable. Mrs. Peterson had lived on Maple Street for 32 years. She knew every family, every car, and every routine in the neighborhood. She prided herself on being observant, on keeping an eye out for anything unusual. In her mind, she was being a good neighbor by staying alert. But her definition of unusual was shaped by fears and assumptions. She had never really examined as she watched David check under his hood and then lean against his car. Mrs. Peterson became more and more convinced that something wasn't right. Why would someone park on her street and just stand there? Why hadn't she seen this man before? Her imagination began to create scenarios that had nothing to do with the simple reality of a broken-down car. After watching for about 10 minutes, Mrs. Peterson made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and dialed 911. Her hands were slightly shaking as she waited for someone to answer. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher asked. Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person, Mrs. Peterson said, her voice nervous but determined. There's a young man on Maple Street who's been standing by a car for about 20 minutes now. I think he might be trying to break into it or case the neighborhood. He doesn't belong here. The dispatcher asked for more details about the location and the person she was reporting. Mrs. Peterson gave them David's exact location and described him as a suspicious black male who appeared to be up to no good. She was convinced she was doing the right thing, protecting her neighborhood from potential crime. Meanwhile, David had no idea that he was now the subject of a police report. He was checking his phone, reading messages from his military buddies, and thinking about the next day's plans. The roadside assistance company had sent him a text saying their truck was on the way, so he settled in to wait patiently. But as he stood there in the quiet evening air, something else started happening to David. A feeling he knew too well began creeping up on him. His chest started to feel tight, like someone was slowly squeezing it. His breathing became a little more shallow, a little more forced. David recognized these signs immediately. Since returning from his last deployment 6 months ago, he had been dealing with panic attacks. They would come out of nowhere, triggered by stress, loud noises, or sometimes nothing at all. His military doctor had explained that this was a normal response to the trauma he had experienced overseas. But knowing that didn't make the attacks any easier to handle. The panic started small, just a slight shortness of breath that David tried to control with the techniques his therapist had taught him. He focused on breathing slowly and steadily, counting his breaths and trying to stay calm. But the attack was building, and David could feel his control slipping away. His heart began to race, pounding so hard he could feel it in his ears. Sweat broke out on his forehead despite the cool evening air. His hands started shaking, and the peaceful suburban street suddenly felt threatening and dangerous. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential enemy. Every normal sound became a possible threat. David tried to focus on his surroundings, reminding himself that he was safe, that he was home in America, not in a war zone. But his body wasn't listening to his mind. The panic attack was taking over, and David knew he needed help. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone again and dialed 911. It took 3 tries to get the numbers right because his fingers were shaking so badly. When the dispatcher answered, David could barely speak. "I need an ambulance," he managed to say, his voice weak and shaky. "I'm having a medical emergency." "I think I'm having a panic attack, but it feels really bad. I can't catch my breath." The dispatcher was professional and calm, asking for his location and symptoms. David gave them the address on Maple Street and tried to describe what was happening to him. The dispatcher assured him that help was on the way and stayed on the line with him, talking him through breathing exercises to try to help him stay calm. As David waited for the ambulance, leaning against his car and fighting to control his breathing, he had no idea that 2 different emergency responses were heading his way. The ambulance he had called for was rushing to help him with his medical emergency. But thanks to Mrs. Peterson's call, a police car was also heading toward Maple Street, with an officer who believed he was responding to a potential crime in progress. The stage was set for a collision between David's medical crisis and the police officer's assumptions about crime and danger. In just a few minutes, a simple car breakdown and panic attack would spiral into something much more serious. Something that would change David's life forever and expose the dangerous consequences of prejudice and fear in American communities. The ambulance's sirens cut through the quiet evening air as it raced down Maple Street. Kelly Rodriguez had been a paramedic for 8 years, and she could tell from the dispatch call that this was going to be a serious situation. A young man was having what sounded like a severe panic attack, possibly with cardiac complications. These calls always worried her because you never knew if it was just anxiety or something more dangerous. Kelly's partner, Mike Thompson, was driving carefully, but quickly through the suburban streets. They had responded to this neighborhood before, usually for elderly residents having heart problems or accidents around the house. It was rare to get a call about a young person having a medical emergency here, which made Kelly even more concerned about what they might find. As they turned onto Maple Street, Kelly could see a man leaning against a car about halfway down the block. Even from a distance, she could tell he was in distress. His posture was hunched over, and he seemed to be struggling just to stay upright. Mike pulled the ambulance up behind the broken-down car and immediately turned on their emergency lights to make the scene safe. Kelly grabbed her medical bag and jumped out of the ambulance. She could hear David before she could see him clearly. His breathing was rapid and shallow, almost like he was hyperventilating. As she approached, she could see sweat covering his face despite the cool evening air, and his hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Sir, I'm Kelly, and I'm a paramedic," she said in her calmest, most reassuring voice. "Can you tell me what's happening?" "Can you tell me your name?" David looked up at her, his eyes wide with panic and confusion. He tried to speak, but the words came out in short, choppy sentences between his rapid breathing. My name ... is David. I can't ... can't breathe. My chest ... it hurts. Kelly immediately began her assessment. She could see all the classic signs of a panic attack, the rapid breathing, sweating, trembling, and obvious distress. But she also knew that panic attacks could sometimes mask more serious medical problems, especially in young, seemingly healthy people. She couldn't take any chances. David, I need you to try to slow down your breathing for me, Kelly said while pulling out her equipment. I know it's scary, but you're going to be okay. We're going to take good care of you. Mike had joined them and was already setting up the stretcher. Kelly began checking David's vital signs while talking to him continuously, trying to keep him calm and focused. His pulse was racing at over 120 beats per minute, and his blood pressure was elevated. His breathing was so rapid that she was worried he might pass out from hyperventilation. David, have you ever had anything like this happen before? Kelly asked while attaching a blood pressure cuff to his arm. David nodded weakly. Since I got back ... from deployment. Happens sometimes, but never this bad. That information was crucial for Kelly. She realized she was dealing with a veteran who was likely suffering from combat-related PTSD. This wasn't just a simple panic attack. This was a trained soldier whose mind and body were reliving traumatic experiences. She had seen this before, and she knew how serious it could get. Okay, David, you're a veteran, Kelly said with even more gentleness in her voice. Thank you for your service. I need you to know that you're safe right now. You're on a quiet street in a safe neighborhood, and there's no danger here. Can you try to focus on my voice? But David was getting worse, not better. His breathing became even more labored, and he started to lose focus. Kelly could see that he was beginning to dissociate, a common symptom when panic attacks became severe. His eyes had a distant look, like he wasn't really seeing the suburban street around him anymore. Mike, we need to get him to the hospital now, Kelly said urgently. This is beyond what we can treat in the field. They helped David onto the stretcher, which was difficult because his legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand. Kelly continued to monitor his vital signs while Mike prepared the ambulance for transport. She started in 4 to give David some fluids and medication to help calm his system, but she knew the real treatment would have to happen at the hospital. As they loaded David into the back of the ambulance, Kelly noticed that a few neighbors had come out of their houses to see what was happening. She could see curtains moving in windows and people standing on their porches, watching the scene with curiosity and concern. She hoped their presence might actually help David feel safer, but she could see that he was barely aware of his surroundings. Any more inside the ambulance, Kelly worked quickly to stabilize David's condition. She gave him oxygen to help with his breathing and continued to monitor his heart rate and blood pressure. The medication she had given him through the 4 was starting to help a little, but David was still in severe distress. David, can you hear me? Kelly asked, shining a small light in his eyes to check his responsiveness. We're going to take you to the hospital where they can help you feel better. David's response was barely a whisper. I was just ... car broke down. I don't... UNDRSTND. Why is this happening? Kelly's heart went out to him. She had seen too many veterans struggling with the invisible wounds of war. Young men and women who had served their country with honor only to come home and fight a different kind of battle. She made sure to document everything carefully in her report, noting that this was clearly a medical emergency and not a criminal matter. You're going to be okay, she told David, holding his hand to try to ground him in the present moment. Sometimes our bodies react to stress in ways we can't control. It doesn't mean you're weak or that anything is wrong with you as a person. This is just your body's way of dealing with difficult experiences. Mike had finished preparing for transport and was about to tell Kelly they were ready to leave for the hospital when they both heard the sound that would change everything. Police sirens were approaching from the other direction, getting louder and closer. Kelly looked out the back window. of the ambulance and saw red and blue lights reflecting off the houses. "Are they coming here?" Mike asked, confused. "We didn't call for police backup." Kelly was equally puzzled. This was clearly a medical call, not a criminal matter. There was no reason for police to be involved in transporting a veteran having a panic attack to the hospital. She assumed they must be responding to a different call somewhere nearby, but as the police car got closer, Kelly realized with growing concern that they were indeed coming to their location. The cruiser pulled up right behind the ambulance, and she could see an officer getting out of his car with the kind of urgency that suggested he thought he was responding to a crime scene. "This doesn't make sense," Kelly muttered to Mike. "Why would they send police to a medical emergency?" She looked back at David, who was still struggling with his breathing and seemed completely unaware that police had arrived. Kelly made a quick decision to focus entirely on her patient and let Mike handle any questions the officer might have. Her job was to provide medical care, and David clearly needed to get to the hospital as quickly as possible. Kelly checked David's vital signs one more time and was pleased to see that the medication was starting to work. His heart rate had dropped slightly and his breathing was becoming a little more regular. She was confident that with proper treatment at the hospital, David would recover fully from this episode, but as she prepared to tell Mike they were ready for transport, she heard heavy footsteps approaching the back of the ambulance. The officer was walking toward them with what sounded like determination, and Kelly had a sinking feeling that their simple medical transport was about to become much more complicated. She looked down at David, who trusted her to get him safely to medical care and made a silent promise that she would protect him and advocate for his needs no matter what happened next. She had no way of knowing that in the next few minutes she would be forced to defend not just her patient's medical needs, but his basic human dignity. Officer Jake Morrison stepped out of his patrol car with the confidence of someone who had been doing this job for 15 years. The radio dispatch had described a suspicious person reported by a concerned neighbor, and in his experience these calls usually meant trouble. He had responded to dozens of similar situations in this quiet suburban area, and they almost always involved someone who didn't belong in the neighborhood trying to break into cars or houses. As Jake walked toward the ambulance, he was already forming assumptions about what he would find. The presence of emergency medical services told him that whatever had started as a suspicious person call had escalated into something more serious. Maybe the suspect had been injured while trying to break into the car. Maybe there had been a confrontation with the homeowner. In Jake's mind, the ambulance was there because of a criminal situation, not a medical emergency. Kelly heard the officer's heavy footsteps approaching and felt her stomach tighten with worry. She had been a paramedic long enough to know that police involvement in medical calls could sometimes complicate things, especially when the officer didn't understand the situation. She looked down at David, who was finally starting to stabilize thanks to the medication and oxygen she had given him. "Ma'am, I need to speak with your patient," Jake announced as he reached the back of the ambulance. His tone was authoritative and left no room for discussion. "I'm responding to a report of suspicious activity in this area." Kelly looked up at the officer, confused by his aggressive approach. "Officer, this gentleman is experiencing a medical emergency. He's a veteran having a severe panic attack, and we need to transport him to the hospital immediately." Jake peered into the ambulance, and his eyes immediately fixed on David. He saw a young black man lying on a stretcher, breathing heavily with medical equipment attached to him. But instead of seeing a patient in distress, Jake saw what he had been expecting to find: a suspect who was now trying to avoid questioning by claiming to be sick. "I still need to speak with him," Jake insisted, stepping closer to the ambulance. "I have a report that someone matching his description was acting suspiciously in this neighborhood. I need to verify his identity and find out what he was doing here." David, still disoriented from his panic attack, could hear voices but couldn't focus on what they were saying. The medication Kelly had given him was helping with his breathing, but his mind was still foggy and confused. Through his haze, he could make out the shape of a police officer standing at the back of the ambulance, and something about the situation made his anxiety spike again. Sir, can you hear me? Jake called out to David in a loud, commanding voice. I need you to answer some questions. What's your name, and what were you doing on this street? Kelly immediately stepped between the officer and her patient. Officer, please lower your voice. This man is in medical distress and you're making his condition worse. He needs immediate transport to the hospital. But Jake was not convinced that this was really a medical emergency. In his experience, criminals often faked injuries or illness to avoid arrest or questioning. He had seen it countless times. Suspects claiming to have chest pains or breathing problems when they were caught doing something illegal. The fact that this man was in an ambulance didn't prove anything to Jake. Ma'am, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I have a job to perform here, Jake said firmly. Someone called 911 to report suspicious activity, and this man was the only person in the area. I need to investigate that report before anyone goes anywhere. David tried to sit up on the stretcher, his military training telling him to respond, when authority figures spoke to him. But the movement made him dizzy, and he fell back against the pillow. His breathing started to become rapid again as the stress of the situation triggered another wave of panic. My name is David Williams, he managed to say in a weak voice. I'm a Navy SEAL. My car broke down and I called for help because I was having a panic attack. Jake heard the words but didn't believe them. He had heard all kinds of stories from people trying to talk their way out of trouble. Claims of military service were common, and Jake had learned to be skeptical of such claims, especially when they came from young black men in wealthy white neighborhoods. Sure you are, Jake said with obvious disbelief. And I suppose you just happened to be in this neighborhood by accident? You just happened to be standing around someone else's car for 20 minutes? Kelly was growing more frustrated and concerned by the minute. She could see that David's vital signs were starting to spike again as the officer's questioning stressed him out. The progress they had made in stabilizing his condition was being undone by this unnecessary confrontation. Officer, please, Kelly pleaded. You can see that this man is connected to medical monitoring equipment. His heart rate and blood pressure are elevated. He's having a genuine medical emergency, and your questioning is making it worse. You can speak with him at the hospital after he's been treated. But Jake had made up his mind about what was happening here. He saw a suspicious person who had been reported by a concerned citizen, and now that person was trying to avoid accountability by pretending to be sick. The fact that the paramedics were defending him only reinforced Jake's belief that he was dealing with a clever criminal who had manipulated the medical personnel. I need to see some identification, Jake demanded, this time speaking directly to David. And I need to know exactly what you were doing on this street and why you were reported as acting suspiciously. David fumbled weakly for his wallet, but his hands were still shaking from the panic attack and the medication. Kelly tried to help him, but Jake interpreted this as interference with his investigation. Ma'am, please step back and let him handle this himself, Jake ordered. If he's really as sick as you claim, then he should be able to answer simple questions and show me his ID. The situation was rapidly spinning out of control. What should have been a simple medical transport was turning into an interrogation, and Kelly could see that her patient was suffering because of it. David's breathing was becoming labored again, and his heart rate was climbing back up to dangerous levels. Mike, Kelly's partner, had been watching from the driver's seat and decided to try a different approach. He got out of the ambulance and walked over to where Jake was standing. Officer, I'm Mike Thompson, Kelly's partner, he said in a calm, professional tone. We've been paramedics for years, and I can tell you with certainty that this man is having a genuine medical emergency. His vital signs confirm it, and his symptoms are consistent with severe anxiety or panic disorder. We really need to get him to the hospital. Jake looked at Mike with slightly more respect than he had shown Kelly, but his suspicion remained strong. I understand you think you're dealing with a medical situation, he said, but I have to investigate a criminal complaint. Someone in this neighborhood was concerned enough to call 911 about this man's behavior. I can't just ignore that because he claims to be sick. The standoff continued, with Kelly and Mike trying to advocate for their patient's medical needs while Jake insisted on his right to investigate the suspicious person report. David lay on the stretcher, caught in the middle of a situation that was quickly moving beyond anyone's control. Kelly made a decision that she hoped would resolve the crisis. "Officer, what if we compromise? You can follow us to the hospital and speak with our patient there after he's been medically cleared. That way you can complete your investigation and we can make sure he gets the medical care he needs." For a moment, it seemed like Jake might accept this reasonable solution. But as he looked at David lying on the stretcher, something in the officer's expression hardened. He had dealt with too many people who he believed had tried to manipulate the system, and he wasn't going to let it happen again. "No," Jake said firmly. "I need answers now, before anyone goes anywhere. This man is going to answer my questions, and he's going to do it right here." The tension on Maple Street was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake Morrison stood at the back of the ambulance, his hand resting on his duty belt, staring down at David with growing impatience. Kelly and Mike exchanged worried glances as they watched their patient's condition deteriorate under the stress of the confrontation. What had started as a simple medical emergency was turning into something much more dangerous. "I'm not asking again," Jake said, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "I need to see your identification, and I need to know what you were doing in this neighborhood. Stop playing games with me." David tried to focus on the officer's words, but the combination of his panic attack and the medication Kelly had given him made it hard to think clearly. His wallet was in his back pocket, but reaching for it while lying on the stretcher was difficult. His hands were still shaking, and every movement felt like it took enormous effort. "Officer, please," Kelly said, stepping closer to her patient. "Can't you see that he's struggling? His hands are shaking from the medical emergency. Let me help him get his wallet." But Jake interpreted Kelly's protective instincts as obstruction. In his mind, the paramedic was helping a suspect avoid complying with police orders. He had seen this kind of thing before: civilians who thought they knew better than law enforcement, who interfered with investigations because they believed some sob story. "Ma'am, I've told you multiple times to step back," Jake said sharply. "This man is perfectly capable of following simple instructions. If he can't produce ID, then I have to assume he's trying to hide something." The neighbors who had gathered on their porches to watch the commotion were getting a clear view of what was happening. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street had started recording on her phone, sensing that something wasn't right about the situation. Mr. Chen from 2 houses down was also filming, his instincts telling him this was going to be important evidence of something. David finally managed to pull his wallet from his pocket, but his hands were shaking so badly that he dropped it on the floor of the ambulance. The wallet fell open, scattering his cards and papers across the ambulance floor. His military ID, driver's license, and credit cards were now mixed together in a small pile. Jake saw the dropped wallet as another sign of suspicious behavior. "Pick it up," he ordered. "Get out of that ambulance and pick up your things. I want to see everything." Kelly couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Officer, this man is a patient under medical care. He's connected to monitoring equipment and an IV line. I cannot allow you to order him out of the ambulance. It would be dangerous to his health." "I don't care about your medical equipment," Jake responded angrily. "I have a criminal investigation to conduct, and this man is going to cooperate whether he likes it or not." David heard the argument escalating around him and tried to help by attempting to get up from the stretcher. His military training had taught him to obey authority figures, even when he didn't understand the situation. But as he tried to sit up, the IV line in his arm pulled tight, and he felt dizzy from the sudden movement. "I can get up," David said, weakly, trying to swing his legs over the side of the stretcher. "I can show you my ID?" Kelly immediately put her hands on David's shoulders to keep him lying down. "No, David, you need to stay on the stretcher. You're still having a medical emergency, and moving around could make it worse." Jake saw Kelly restraining David and misinterpreted the entire situation. To him, it looked like the paramedic was preventing his suspect from complying with police orders. He had reached the end of his patience with what he saw as a deliberate obstruction of justice. "That's it," Jake announced. "Sir, you are going to get out of that ambulance right now, or I'm going to remove you myself." You are interfering with a police investigation. Mike tried one more time to de-escalate the situation. Officer Morrison, please listen to reason. This man called 911 himself because he was having a panic attack. He's a veteran with PTSD. We have all his vital signs documented, and they clearly show he's in medical distress. There's no crime here. But Jake had convinced himself that he was dealing with an elaborate deception. In his view, David was a criminal who had manipulated the paramedics into believing his fake medical emergency. The more they defended him, the more convinced Jake became that something illegal was being covered up. I'm done arguing with all of you, Jake said, stepping closer to the ambulance. Sir, you have 3 seconds to get out of that ambulance. Voluntarily, or I'm going to physically remove you. David, still confused and disoriented, tried to stand up again. He didn't want to cause trouble for the paramedics who had been so kind to him. But as he attempted to get to his feet, his legs buckled. The combination of the panic attack, medication, and stress had left him weak and unsteady. Jake saw David's unsteadiness as resistance or fake behavior. Without warning, he reached into the ambulance and grabbed David's arm, trying to pull him out of the vehicle. Kelly immediately protested, but Jake ignored her completely. Officers, stop, Kelly shouted. You're endangering my patient. He's connected to medical equipment. The 4-line was stretched to its limit as Jake pulled on David's arm. David tried to cooperate, but he was genuinely unable to support his own weight. As Jake continued to pull him toward the edge of the ambulance, David's legs gave out completely, and he started to fall. Jake, interpreting David's collapse as an attempt to resist arrest, became even more aggressive. Stop resisting, he yelled, even though David was clearly not fighting back. Get on the ground now. The situation had spiraled completely out of control. David found himself being dragged from the ambulance by an officer who believed he was a criminal, while the paramedics who had been caring for him watched in horror. The 4-line was ripped from his arm, and the monitoring equipment alarms began beeping as the connections were broken. Kelly tried to intervene physically, reaching for David to support him and prevent him from being injured. Officer, please, you're hurting him. He's having a medical emergency. But Jake saw Kelly's intervention as assault on a police officer. Get away from me, he shouted at her. You're interfering with an arrest. David was now on the ground beside the ambulance, still dizzy and weak from his medical condition. He tried to follow Jake's commands, but his body wasn't responding normally. The panic attack was returning full force, triggered by the physical confrontation and the stress of the situation. Please, David managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. I'm a Navy SEAL. I served 3 tours overseas. I was just having a panic attack. My car broke down. Jake heard the words but was too angry and suspicious to process them rationally. He saw a young black man in a wealthy white neighborhood who had been reported as suspicious and who was now claiming to be a war hero. To Jake, it sounded like a desperate lie from someone who had been caught doing something illegal. The neighbors continued filming as the situation unfolded in front of them. Mrs. Rodriguez was narrating quietly into her phone camera, explaining what she was seeing for the recording. Mr. Chun had called his wife outside to witness what was happening. Both of them shocked by the officer's treatment of someone who was clearly in medical distress. Kelly and Mike were now both trying to protect their patient while dealing with an increasingly aggressive police officer who seemed determined to treat a medical emergency as a criminal matter. They had never encountered anything like this in their years of emergency medical service, and they were struggling to understand how a simple panic attack call had turned into such a dangerous confrontation. The sound of another police siren cut through the chaos on Maple Street just as Jake was reaching for his handcuffs. Sergeant Patricia Rodriguez had been monitoring the radio traffic and decided to check on what sounded like a routine suspicious person call that was taking longer than usual. She had been a police supervisor for 12 years, and her experience told her that when simple calls dragged on, it usually meant something had gone wrong. As Patricia pulled up behind Jake's patrol car, she could immediately see that the situation was out of control. There was an ambulance with its emergency lights flashing, medical equipment scattered on the ground, and her officer standing over a black man who was clearly in distress. The paramedics were trying to provide medical care while arguing with Jake, and several neighbors were recording everything on their phones. Patricia had worked with Jake before and knew he had a tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily. She had counseled him multiple times about his aggressive approach to policing, but he always insisted he was just doing his job thoroughly. Looking at the scene in front of her, Patricia realized that Jake's approach had finally gone too far. "Morrison, what's the situation here?" Patricia called out as she approached, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to taking control of chaotic scenes. Jake looked up, relieved to see backup arriving. In his mind, another officer would validate his actions and help him arrest what he believed was a dangerous suspect who had been resisting his investigation. "Sergeant, I responded to a suspicious person call," Jake said, slightly out of breath from the confrontation. "This individual was reported acting suspiciously in the neighborhood, and when I tried to question him, he refused to cooperate. The paramedics have been interfering with my investigation." Patricia looked at the scene more carefully. She could see David lying on the ground, clearly struggling to breathe, with torn medical equipment around him. Kelly was kneeling beside him, trying to check his pulse while Mike was gathering the scattered medical supplies. The fourth line that had been torn from David's arm was bleeding slightly, and his face was pale and covered in sweat. "Officer Morrison, step back from the individual," Patricia ordered firmly. Something about this situation didn't look right to her, and she needed to assess what was really happening before it got worse. Kelly looked up at the new officer with desperate hope in her eyes. "Sergeant, please, this man is having a medical emergency. He's a veteran with PTSD who was having a panic attack. We were trying to transport him to the hospital when your officer pulled him out of our ambulance." Patricia knelt down beside David, her training in crisis intervention kicking. She could see immediately that this was not a criminal suspect. This was someone in genuine medical distress. His breathing was labored, his skin was clammy, and his eyes had the unfocused look of someone experiencing severe anxiety or trauma. "Sir? Can you hear me?" Patricia asked David in a gentle voice. "What's your name?" David tried to focus on the new officer's face. Through his panic and confusion, he could sense that this person was different from the first officer. Her tone was calm and professional, not aggressive and threatening. "David Williams," he managed to whisper. "I'm a Navy SEAL. I was having a panic attack. My car broke down." Patricia's expression changed as she processed what David had just told her. She looked around and spotted David's wallet and scattered cards on the ground nearby. "Can someone hand me his identification?" she asked Kelly. Kelly quickly gathered up David's cards and handed them to Patricia. As the sergeant examined the military ID, her face went pale. The card clearly identified David Williams as an active-duty Navy SEAL with multiple deployments and commendations. This wasn't a criminal. This was a decorated war veteran who had served his country with honor. "Morrison, get over here right now," Patricia called to Jake, her voice sharp with anger. Jake approached confidently, expecting to be praised for his thorough investigation of a suspicious person. "Yes, Sergeant? Are you ready to help me process this arrest?" Patricia held up David's military ID so Jake could see it clearly. "This man is a Navy SEAL, Morrison. He's a decorated veteran who was having a medical emergency. There is no crime here, no arrest to be made. You just assaulted a member of our armed forces who was seeking medical help." Jake's face went white as he stared at the military ID. For the first time since arriving on the scene, doubt began to creep into his mind. But his pride and his need to justify his actions made him defensive rather than apologetic. "How was I supposed to know that?" Jake protested. "He was reported as suspicious and he wasn't cooperating with my investigation. These things can be faked, you know." Patricia was furious but kept her voice controlled. She had seen too many situations where officers' assumptions and biases led to unnecessary confrontations, but this was one of the worst examples she had ever witnessed. "Morrison, look around you," Patricia said, gesturing to the medical equipment and the paramedics. Does this look like a crime scene to you? You have a man connected to medical monitoring equipment, being treated by paramedics, and your first instinct was to arrest him? Kelly had managed to get David sitting up against the ambulance, and she was trying to assess the damage from his rough treatment. His pulse was racing again, and his breathing had become shallow. The physical confrontation had undone all the progress they had made in stabilizing his condition. We need to get him to the hospital immediately, Kelly told Patricia. His condition has deteriorated significantly because of this incident. He needs professional medical evaluation for both his original panic attack and now the trauma of being assaulted while seeking medical help. Patricia nodded and turned back to Jake. Officer Morrison, you need to step away from this scene immediately. I'm taking over this situation, and you are not to have any further contact with Mr. Williams. But Jake wasn't ready to back down completely. His reputation and his version of events were at stake, and he felt the need to defend his actions one more time. Sergeant, I responded to a legitimate 911 call about suspicious activity, Jake said, his voice rising. I followed proper procedure for investigating that call. If this man had simply cooperated from the beginning, none of this would have happened. Patricia stared at Jake in disbelief. Even faced with clear evidence that he had made a serious mistake, he was still trying to blame David for the situation. She realized that this incident was going to require a full investigation and probably disciplinary action. Morrison, return to your vehicle and write your report, Patricia ordered. We'll discuss your version of proper procedure later. As Jake reluctantly walked back to his patrol car, Patricia turned her attention to helping the paramedics care. For David, she knelt down beside him and spoke in the same gentle tone she might use with her own son. Mr. Williams, I want to apologize for what just happened to you, she said sincerely. You were seeking medical help, and you should never have been treated that way. We're going to make sure you get to the hospital safely. David looked up at Patricia with confusion and exhaustion in his eyes. I don't understand what happened, he said weakly. I just called for help because I was having a panic attack. Why did he think I was a criminal? Patricia didn't have a good answer for that question, because the truth was too painful and complicated to explain to a man who was already traumatized. The truth was that Jake had seen a young black man in a wealthy, white neighborhood and had automatically assumed criminal intent. Despite clear evidence of a medical emergency, the neighbors who had been recording the entire incident were now gathered closer, murmuring among themselves about what they had witnessed. Mrs. Rodriguez approached Patricia with her phone still recording. Officer, I filmed everything that happened here, she told Patricia. That first policeman attacked a man who was clearly sick and needed help. This is not right, Patricia nodded grimly. She knew that by tomorrow, this incident would be all over social media and the local news. A decorated Navy SEAL assaulted while seeking medical help. It was exactly the kind of story that would spark outrage and demands for accountability. By the time the ambulance finally left Maple Street with David inside, Mrs. Rodriguez had already uploaded her video to 3 different social media platforms. She had titled it Police Officer Attacks Navy SEAL Having Medical Emergency and added hashtags that she hoped would help spread the word about what she had witnessed. As she sat in her living room, still shaking from what she had seen, she watched the view count on her video climb rapidly dot at Mercy General Hospital. Dr. Jennifer Martinez was finishing her shift in the emergency room when the ambulance arrived. With David, Kelly had called ahead to explain the situation. So the medical team was prepared for both the original panic attack and the additional trauma from the police encounter. As they wheeled David into the treatment room, Dr. Martinez could see immediately that this was more than just a standard anxiety case. Mr. Williams, I'm Dr. Martinez, she said gently as she began her examination. The paramedics told me what happened to you today. We're going to take very good care of you and make sure you're okay. David was more alert now than he had been on the street, but he was still visibly shaken by everything that had occurred. His hands trembled as he tried to answer the doctor's questions about his medical history and current symptoms. The physical injuries from his encounter with Jake were minor, a bruised arm and a small cut where the fore had been torn out, but Dr. Martinez was more concerned about the psychological impact. "Can you tell me about your military service?" Dr. Martinez asked while checking David's vital signs. "The paramedics mentioned you're dealing with some PTSD symptoms." David nodded slowly. "I've done 3 deployments in the last 5 years. Started having panic attacks about 6 months ago after I got back from my last tour. My therapist says it's normal, but today was the worst one I've ever had." Dr. Martinez made careful notes as David spoke. She had treated other veterans with similar conditions, and she understood how traumatic events could trigger severe anxiety responses. But she had never seen a case where seeking medical help had led to police violence, and she was deeply troubled by what had happened to her patient. Meanwhile, back on Maple Street, Mrs. Rodriguez's video was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. Her neighbor Mr. Chun had also posted his footage from a different angle, and together the 2 videos provided a complete picture of what had transpired. People were sharing the videos with comments expressing outrage and disbelief that a veteran could be treated so badly while having a medical emergency. The first news station to pick up the story was Channel 7, where reporter Amanda Foster was. MONITORING social media for breaking news. She had seen the videos within 2 hours of them being posted and immediately recognized this as a major story. By 8 p.m. that evening, she was standing on Maple Street with a camera crew, interviewing neighbors about what they had witnessed. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," Mrs. Rodriguez told the reporter, still emotional about the events. "This young man was clearly sick and needed help. The paramedics were taking care of him, and then that police officer just attacked him for no reason. It was horrible to watch." The story on Channel 7's evening news lasted 4 minutes and included both cell phone videos, interviews with neighbors, and a statement from the hospital confirming that David had indeed been treated for a medical emergency. The news anchor described it as a troubling incident that raises serious questions about police response to mental health crises. By 10 p.m., the story had been picked up by news stations in 3 neighboring cities. Veterans organizations across the state were sharing the videos and demanding answers from the police department. The local chapter of Veterans of Foreign Wars issued a statement calling the incident an unacceptable assault on a decorated serviceman who was seeking medical assistance. At the police station, Chief Robert Thompson was having the worst night of his 25-year career. His phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters, city council members, and angry citizens who had seen the videos. He had already watched the footage a dozen times, and each viewing made him more concerned about the legal and public relations nightmare his department was facing. Patricia Rodriguez was in the chief's office, giving him a detailed report of what she had found when she arrived at the scene. She had been a police officer long enough to know that this incident could have serious consequences for the entire department, not just for Jake Morrison. "Chief, there's no way to spin this positively," Patricia told him honestly. "The videos clearly show Morrison assaulting a man who was receiving medical treatment. The victim is a decorated Navy SEAL with documented PTSD, and there's no evidence of any criminal activity whatsoever." Chief Thompson rubbed his temples, feeling a headache. "Coming on, what's Morrison's story? How is he trying to justify this?" Patricia shook her head. "He's sticking to his original report that he was investigating a suspicious person call and that the subject was resisting his commands. But the videos contradict everything he's claiming. The evidence is overwhelming that he used excessive force against someone who was having a medical emergency." At David's mother's house across town, the phone had been ringing all evening. News reporters had somehow gotten her number and were calling for comments about her son's ordeal. Dorothy Williams was a quiet woman who had always been proud of her son's military service, but she had never dealt with media attention before. "I just want people to know that my David is a good man," she told one persistent reporter. "He's served his country with honor, and he was just trying to get help when he was sick." No one should be treated the way he was treated today. David's military unit had also learned about the incident through social media. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, was driving to the hospital to check on his soldier and to make sure David had all the support he needed. The military took care of its own, and Colonel Patterson was already planning to connect David with the best PTSD specialists and legal advocates available. The videos continued to spread throughout the night, reaching people far beyond the local community. National veterans groups were beginning to take notice, and civil rights organizations were expressing interest in the case. The hashtag Justice for David had started trending in several major cities, with people sharing their own stories of police misconduct and calling for accountability. By midnight, the videos had been viewed more than 100,000 times across all platforms. Comments poured in from veterans, medical professionals, civil rights advocates, and ordinary citizens who were outraged by what they had seen. Many people shared their own experiences with PTSD and panic attacks, explaining how vulnerable and frightening it felt to need medical help during a mental health crisis. Dr. Martinez had decided to keep David in the hospital overnight for observation, both for his medical condition and for his safety. She was concerned that the stress of the incident might trigger additional panic attacks, and she wanted to make sure he was stable before releasing him. As David tried to rest in his hospital bed, he had no idea that his story was spreading across the internet and that thousands of people were rallying to support him. Kelly, the paramedic who had tried so hard to protect David, was at home with her family, but she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She had written a detailed report of the incident and was prepared to testify about what she had witnessed if necessary. As a medical professional, she felt a responsibility to speak out about how police interference had endangered her patient's life. The incident was also being discussed in police stations across the region, where officers were debating what they would have done in Jake Morrison's situation. Many experienced officers were shaking their heads in disbelief, understanding that Morrison had violated basic principles of de-escalation and community policing that were taught in every police academy. As the night wore on, it became clear that this was not going to be a story that disappeared quickly. The combination of a decorated veteran, clear video evidence, and social media amplification had created a perfect storm of public attention and outrage. By morning, David Williams would wake up to find that his personal medical crisis had become a national conversation about police accountability, veterans' rights, and the treatment of people experiencing mental health emergencies. 3 days after the incident on Maple Street, District Attorney Rebecca Shun was sitting in her office staring at a stack of evidence that would determine the fate of Officer Jake Morrison. The case files contained the cell phone videos, body camera footage, medical records, witness statements, and police reports that painted a damning picture of police misconduct. As an elected official who had built her career on holding law enforcement accountable, Rebecca knew this case would define her legacy. The body camera footage from Jake's patrol car was particularly troubling. Unlike his written report, which claimed David had been acting suspiciously and resisting arrest, the video clearly showed a man in obvious medical distress being forcibly removed from an ambulance. Against the protests of trained paramedics, Rebecca had watched the footage multiple times, and each viewing made her more convinced that criminal charges were warranted. At the police station, Internal Affairs investigator Captain Michael Torres was conducting interviews with everyone who had been present during the incident. His investigation had to be thorough and impartial, even though the evidence against Morrison seemed overwhelming. Captain Torres had been investigating police misconduct for 8 years, but he had rarely seen a case with such clear video evidence of excessive force. Kelly, the paramedic, sat across from Captain Torres in the interview room, recounting her experience with detailed precision. "Officer Morrison completely ignored our medical assessment," she explained. "We told him repeatedly that Mr. Williams was having a medical emergency and needed immediate transport to the hospital. He treated our ambulance like it was a crime scene instead of a medical response." Mike, Kelly's partner, corroborated every detail of her account. "I've been a paramedic for 12 years, he told the investigator. I've never seen a police officer interfere with medical treatment like that. It was dangerous and completely unnecessary. The investigation revealed that Jake Morrison had a troubling pattern of complaints filed against him over his 15-year career. Citizens had accused him of using excessive force, racial profiling, and aggressive behavior during routine traffic stops, while previous complaints had been dismissed or resulted in minor disciplinary action. This incident was different because of the clear video evidence and the high-profile nature of the case. David was released from the hospital after 2 days of observation, but his ordeal was far from over. At his small apartment across town, he was struggling to process everything that had happened to him. The panic attacks that had been manageable before were now occurring multiple times per day, triggered by the trauma of being assaulted while seeking medical help. Colonel Patterson, David's commanding officer, had arranged for him to meet with the military's best PTSD specialists and had also connected him with a team of civil rights lawyers who specialized in police misconduct cases. The legal team, led by attorney Rachel Washington, was preparing both criminal complaints and a federal civil rights lawsuit that could result in significant consequences for Officer Morrison and the police department. "David, what happened to you was not just wrong, it was illegal," Attorney Washington explained during their first meeting. "Officer Morrison violated your constitutional rights while you were in a vulnerable state seeking medical assistance. We're going to make sure he faces the full consequences of his actions." The story continued to gain national attention as more news outlets picked up the case. CNN ran a segment about police response to mental health crises using David's case as an example of how things can go tragically wrong when officers aren't properly trained to handle medical emergencies. Fox News covered the story from the angle of veteran mistreatment, highlighting David's military service and the disrespect shown to someone who had sacrificed for his country. Social media campaigns supporting David were growing stronger each day. Veterans across the country were sharing their own stories of struggling with PTSD and expressing outrage that seeking medical help could result in police violence. The hashtag Justice for David had been shared over 1 million times, and online fundraisers to help with David's medical and legal expenses had raised more than $50. At City Hall, Mayor Linda Thompson was facing intense pressure from multiple directions. City Council members were demanding action against Officer Morrison, while the police union was defending him and claiming he had followed proper procedures. Protesters had been gathering outside City Hall every day since the videos went viral, carrying signs that read "Veterans deserve better" and "Medical emergency is not a crime." The police union representative, Thomas Bradley, held a press conference attempting to defend Morrison's actions. Officer Morrison responded to a legitimate 911 call about suspicious activity, Bradley stated. He was following standard procedure for investigating potential criminal behavior. The fact that this individual turned out to be a veteran doesn't change the officer's obligation to investigate suspicious activity reports. But the union's defense was undermined by the overwhelming video evidence and expert testimony from medical professionals. Dr. Martinez, who had treated David at the hospital, spoke to reporters about the obvious signs of medical distress that should have been apparent to any reasonable observer. Mr. Williams displayed classic symptoms of a severe panic attack, Dr. Martinez explained. His rapid breathing, sweating, disorientation, and connection to medical monitoring equipment should have made it clear to anyone that this was a medical emergency, not a criminal situation. The FBI had also opened a federal civil rights investigation into the incident, sending agents to interview witnesses and collect evidence. Federal involvement meant that Morrison could face charges that carried much more serious penalties than anything the local district attorney could pursue. Civil rights violations against people seeking medical care were taken very seriously by federal prosecutors. As the investigation progressed, more details emerged about the original 911 call that had brought Morrison to the scene. Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor who had reported David as suspicious, was struggling with guilt and public criticism for her role in starting the chain of events. In interviews with investigators, She admitted that she had made assumptions based on David's race and her own fears about crime in her neighborhood. "I thought I was being a good neighbor by reporting someone who looked out of place," Mrs. Peterson told investigators, tears in her eyes. "I never imagined that my call would lead to a veteran being attacked while he was having a medical emergency. I feel terrible about what happened." The case was also sparking broader conversations about police training and response to mental health crises. Police reform advocates pointed to David's case as evidence that officers needed better education about recognizing medical emergencies and de-escalation techniques. Many cities were re-examining their policies about police involvement in medical calls. Chief Thompson announced that the police department would be implementing new training requirements for all officers, focusing on mental health awareness and proper response to medical emergencies. But critics argued that policy changes weren't enough. They wanted to see Morrison face serious criminal charges as an example that police misconduct would not be tolerated. David's story was also having an impact on other veterans dealing with PTSD. Veteran support groups reported increased calls from service members who had been inspired by David's courage to speak out about his own struggles. Mental health advocates used his case to highlight the importance of treating PTSD as a legitimate medical condition that required compassion and professional care, not suspicion and punishment. As the week progressed, pressure mounted on District Attorney Chun to announce her decision about criminal charges. Legal experts who had reviewed the evidence were predicting that Morrison would face multiple felony charges, including assault, violation of civil rights, and endangering someone seeking medical care. The case had become about more than just one police officer's bad decision. It had become a symbol of larger problems in American policing and society's treatment of veterans and people with mental health conditions. David Williams, who had simply been trying to get help for a panic attack, had unwittingly become the center of a national conversation about justice, accountability, and the rights of people in crisis. For David himself, the attention was overwhelming and sometimes difficult to handle. But with the support of his family, his military unit, and thousands of strangers who had rallied to his cause, he was determined to see the case through to its conclusion. He knew that how this case was resolved would send a message to other veterans and people with mental health conditions about whether they could safely seek help when they needed it most. 6 months after that terrible evening on Maple Street, David Williams stood in the courthouse wearing his Navy dress uniform, watching as Officer Jake Morrison was led away in handcuffs. The jury had taken only 3 hours to find Morrison guilty on all charges: assault, violation of civil rights, and endangering someone seeking medical care. As the judge sentenced Morrison to 2 years in prison and permanently banned him from working in law enforcement, David felt a mixture of relief and sadness that it had taken so long to reach this moment. The criminal trial had been difficult for David to endure. He had to testify about his military service, his struggles with PTSD, and the humiliation of being attacked while seeking medical help. Defense lawyers had tried to portray him as unstable and dangerous, but the video evidence and testimony from medical experts had made Morrison's guilt undeniable. The jury had seen clearly that a decorated veteran had been assaulted for the crime of having a panic attack in the wrong neighborhood. District Attorney Chun held a press conference outside the courthouse after the sentencing. Today's verdict sends a clear message that police officers who abuse their power will be held accountable, she announced to the gathered reporters. No one should fear seeking medical help, especially our veterans who have sacrificed so much for our country. But the criminal conviction was only part of David's fight for justice. The federal civil rights lawsuit had resulted in a settlement of $2.8 million from the city, money that David planned to use to help other veterans struggling with PTSD and to support police reform initiatives. More importantly, the lawsuit had forced the police department to implement sweeping changes in how they responded to mental health crises. Chief Thompson, who had survived the scandal but barely kept his job, stood before the city council to announce the new policies that would bear David's name. The David Williams Protocol requires that all officers receive 40 hours of mental health crisis training, the chief explained. Officers responding to medical emergency calls must now defer to medical professionals on scene, and any use of force against someone receiving medical treatment requires immediate supervisor approval. The changes went beyond just training. The police department had partnered with local hospitals to create a new rapid response team that paired police officers with mental health professionals for crisis calls. When someone reported a person in distress, both a police officer and a mental health counselor would respond together, ensuring that medical emergencies were treated as health issues rather than criminal matters. Kelly, the paramedic who had tried so hard to protect David that night, had become an advocate for these reforms. She now traveled to police departments across the state, training officers on how to recognize medical emergencies and work cooperatively with medical personnel. David's case showed us what happens when law enforcement and medical professionals don't work together, she would tell her audiences. We have to do better. The impact of David's case extended far beyond the local community. Veterans organizations had used his story to push for federal legislation requiring crisis intervention training for all law enforcement agencies that received federal funding. The Veterans Mental Health Protection Act had passed Congress, with bipartisan support, ensuring that David's experience would help prevent similar incidents across the country. At the Veterans Administration Hospital, where David now received treatment, Dr. Rodriguez had started a support group specifically for veterans who had experienced trauma while seeking medical care. David attended the meetings regularly, finding strength in connecting with other service members who understood the unique challenge of being treated as a threat when you were asking for help. I used to be ashamed of my panic attacks, David shared with the group during one session. I thought they made me weak, that they somehow erased all the strength I had shown in combat. But going through this experience taught me that seeking help takes a different kind of courage. David's mother, Dorothy, had become an unexpected activist in her own right. She now spoke at community meetings about the importance of understanding mental health issues and not making assumptions about people in crisis. My son served 3 tours overseas to protect our freedom, she would tell audiences. The least we can do is treat our veterans with dignity when they come home and need our help. The neighborhood where the incident occurred had also changed. Mrs. Peterson, the woman whose 911 call had started the chain of events, had become one of David's strongest supporters. She organized community meetings to discuss racial bias and helped establish a neighborhood watch program focused on helping people in crisis rather than reporting them as suspicious. I learned that my fear and prejudice nearly destroyed an innocent man's life, Mrs. Peterson admitted during one community meeting. We all have a responsibility to examine our assumptions and do better. The police union that had initially defended Morrison eventually issued a public apology to David and announced new training requirements for their members. Union Representative Bradley, who had tried to justify Morrison's actions, resigned in disgrace after internal investigations revealed his own history of covering up misconduct complaints. Jake Morrison himself had become a cautionary tale in police training academies across the country. His case was used to teach new officers about the dangers of racial profiling, the importance of de-escalation, and the legal consequences of excessive force. Morrison lost his pension, his law enforcement certification, and his freedom serving. As a stark reminder that police officers are not above the law, for David, the journey from victim to advocate had been challenging but ultimately healing. He had started a nonprofit organization called Crisis Compassion that provided grants to police departments implementing mental health training programs. The organization also offered support to other people who had experienced police misconduct during medical emergencies. I don't want what happened to me to happen to anyone else, David explained during a television interview on the 1-year anniversary of the incident. But I also want people to know that having PTSD or anxiety doesn't make you broken. It makes you human, and humans deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. The case had also led to changes in how 911 operators handled calls about suspicious persons. New protocols required dispatchers to ask more detailed questions about why someone appeared suspicious and to provide responding officers with better information about the actual nature of the situation. The goal was to prevent assumptions and biases from turning routine calls into dangerous confrontations. David's military unit had rallied around him throughout the ordeal, providing both emotional support and practical assistance with legal proceedings. Colonel Patterson had been promoted and now oversaw veteran services for the entire region, using his platform to advocate for better mental health support for returning service members. David Williams represents the best of military service. Colonel Patterson said during a ceremony honoring David's advocacy work, "He took a personal tragedy and turned it into positive change that will protect other veterans for generations to come." As David walked out of the courthouse that day, surrounded by family, friends, and supporters who had stood by him throughout his fight for justice, he reflected on how much had changed since that terrible night when his car broke down. He still struggled with PTSD and he still had panic attacks occasionally, but he no longer felt ashamed of his condition, and he knew that other veterans and people in crisis would be safer because of the changes his case had brought about. The incident on Maple Street had exposed ugly truths about racial bias, police misconduct, and society's treatment of people with mental health conditions. But it had also shown that ordinary people could come together to demand justice and create positive change. David's courage in speaking out had not only held one bad officer accountable, but had started a movement that would protect countless others who found themselves in crisis and in need of help. The last chapter of David's story was not about the trauma he had endured, but about the hope and healing he had helped create for others who would face similar challenges in the future.